Hello, this is Sam Simon, the editor and compiler of the book, Choosing the Public Interest, First Essays, or the essays from the First Public Interest Research Group. We're, as you know, I hope, because you're listening to this, there are 13 of us, young lawyers out of law school going to work for Ralph Nader for what was then the first ever Public Interest Research Group, which was a public interest law firm. And I read last time from the introductions and the forewords, but I want to spend today, we're going to talk a little bit about my essay. It's the first essay in the book. And it was a little bit about my path to finding Ralph. And it's called Become a Naderator, because I'm advocating for those young people today in college and law schools that go into the public interest. But I also want to talk about a larger point of view and a story that will make that. I think it's important today as we mark the 100 days of the Donald Trump administration and what I see as, and I think many of us see as, a radical new time, not unlike the time when we started, which was the Richard Nixon administration, where Richard Nixon wanted to use extraordinary powers to stay in office. He authorized a break into the Democratic office and wanted to use his extra legal powers to stay in office and to impose his view of the administration. I see today is very similar, but even more. I want to talk about what was it that Ralph Nader was trying to do in 1970. And what was it that attracted us young lawyers to him, and then how that relates to what's happening today. And I'll be quick, actually. So there are about 13 of us. We were in law school. Ralph Nader had written the book Unsafe at Any Speed about the Corvair and how we needed rules and regulations to make sure that products, particularly automobiles, were safe as used, not as built, but as used. And in many ways, like today, a corporation, General Motors, decided the best way to deal with him was to discredit him. And so what they tried to do is they hired, they looked into his record, but then they hired a woman to follow him and then to solicit him and try to discredit him that way. It failed. It was revealed at congressional hearings. So then every summer for 5 years or 4 years, he would hire young law students to go to work for him to investigate how the government was working and to see if they were administrating the laws as intended in this bill, as written. And they wrote big reports on the various commissions and how they were doing and recommended changes. Many of them were adopted, by the way, by Congress based on research and whether they were meeting the intent of the Congress. When we started with Ralph, that 1970, 13 of us, it was very interesting because one thing we had to do was to read the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act. You may not have been familiar with it. It isn't what you read necessarily in law school. It was a requirement. It was a law that requires that all regulations by government agencies had to be published in the Federal Register. There had to be an opportunity for comment and input by the public, and then a written set of rules, which could be then challenged in court. A democracy works that way. I had never actually heard of it. Confession now, 53 years later, until I read it. And it was the way we hold, and it is today, government accountable to administering the laws written by Congress faithfully. Not, however, a president may choose to interpret them. And in fact, I think this maybe was the most important thing that I've ever been part of in my life, even 53 years later, was the first thing, one of the very first things I did, similar to something we did in law school. If you remember, I think last time I wrote about it in law school, I'd stayed up all night with a bunch of law review students and sued the city council of Austin, Texas, to issue a parade permit that allowed anti-war demonstrations to be held in the streets, and we won, and no one was shot like at Kent State. Well, now here we were again just a few years later, and President Richard Nixon decided by executive order to give a tax incentive to a certain industry. He wasn't going to use the Administrative Procedures Act. Well, guess what? My friend and colleague, Thomas Stanton, who has an essay in the book too, you should read it. Get the book and read Tom's. Mine's first, but maybe you could read Tom's first. But Tom and and I will credit Tom as the one who suggested we do it, that Richard Nixon is issuing a tax, in effect, a tax regulation without going through the Administrative Procedures Act. That's illegal. So Tom and I stayed up all night long and drafted a federal complaint, a lawsuit. And that was filed in the morning against the President of the United States. I think I was, 26 years old, my first job out of law school. I'm suing the President of the United States with my friend Tom Stanton, and said the regulation was invalid because he had not gone through the Administrative Procedures Act. And guess what? We won. Now, did we really win? I think so, because what it stood up for is the rule of law. The administration did what the court said. It went through an Administrative Procedures Act proceeding, and they implemented the regulation. It got implemented as the president wanted. It just took a little bit more time. The public had input, and there may have been some changes. So we're talking about today, May Day, May 1st. I just posted on Facebook, May Day, May Day. America is losing the rule of law. May Day, May Day. Well, the rule of law is what democracy in America is built on. It is against executive power overreach. It's the protection there. It assumes a procedure that the laws that Congress does pass are implemented by the administration with public input and meet the intention and purposes of the law. And it gives those affected, the public, the right to participate in that process and make sure that the rules are administered in that way. And that's what's going on today in some ways. But we have, that is, these executive orders that implement the law, implement or change rules based on whatever the whims of the president are being stopped and overturned because they haven't gone through, many of them, the Administrative Procedures Act, and given the public the right to comment, and that a decision is made consistent with the law that it was written at the time it was written. It's called democracy, my friends. Now, young people today, everybody has a role, and that's why I urge young people today to get this book. If you have, or anybody should get it, and find ways to go into the public interest. Yes, protests are great, but I remember that my decision was at a time in 1970, there were protests on the streets. There was violence on the streets. There were young people choosing that as opposed to choosing to use the rule of law to make change and to uphold the rule of law. That's what Ralph Nader stands for, by the way. All the things about Ralph. Ralph worked and still works to use the legal processes to administer the public interest and make sure the rule of law is sustained, not the power of one individual, not a form of what could be called dictatorship, not the whims and whimsy of an executive. It is their job is to implement the laws of Congress in good faith. And so I urge anybody who is interested in finding a model to see how the government should work and how the rule of law would protect the interest of members of Congress and the public's interest. To really get this book and read it, give it to a young person in school now. And you know something for you, people who may have been laid off from work, or you know somebody who's looking for work, call up a local public interest group. There's Public Citizen here in Washington, D.C. There's the Consumer Federation of America. There's the National Consumers League. There are public interest programs in law schools. Volunteer. While you're looking for other work, volunteer and work for, do some work in helping to challenge arbitrary and capricious actions by this administration or any administration. And you too can become a Nader, so to speak. We'll talk more about specific essays in the future, but today on May Day, the 1st of May, which should be about liberty, we are in a state of emergency. And you can help. You can work, you can find a way to be part of urging your congressman to stand up to arbitrary power. Maybe you can be even the plaintiff in one of these cases. So that's my public interest comment for this week, and urging everybody to get a copy of Choosing the Public Interest, essays from the first public interest group. See stories from those who have done that before, and hopefully you'll be inspired to do it yourself, or make sure somebody you know, young people, know how to do that too. Thank you.